Okay, hello everyone. We are going to look at honoring the client's resistance in chapter 3. And we'll start with a conceptual overview. First of all, it is to be expected. So it doesn't mean that therapy isn't working or that you're necessarily out in left field. It's normal for all of us to resist the change that we consciously say that we want. And that would, one way to think about it is it's the shadow side of our intention to make change. So we're going to be talking about this in the lecture, that feelings of shame are extremely important when working with resistance, and feelings of guilt as well. There are going to be many reasons for this, but one example would be talking outside of the family can be seen as disloyal. So it can bring up feelings of shame or guilt simply by coming to therapy and starting to talk about what's going on for that person internally. There also may be anticipations about how you're going to respond based on how family members have responded to clients' needs. And yeah, naturally, this is going to make therapy challenging. So again, this is normal and it's to be expected. It is going to change and vary with each client. I think we're starting to see this in the readings. And looking at attachment theory is a really good way to assess how much resistance your client might present with. So with secure attachment, they've had the opportunity to receive attuned responses to their distress, and they don't feel alone with it. And they therefore have more license or security or safety to talk about their needs, especially upsetting emotions. Now, this is very different for people who have experienced insecure attachment, where that has not been reinforced and that safety has not been consistent. And a deep fear that the therapist is really not interested. Again, we want to make sure that we understand this as being a formative experience. Where not interested doesn't mean what it might mean today as adults, but not interested in terms of what would it have meant to a child, which would be about their emotional safety and therefore safety in general and being in the world. So we want to have a lot of compassion for what we're calling resistance. So you want to start to see signposts for resistance. And the first thing you want to do is validate what they talk about. For example, a busy schedule, unforeseen events. The likelihood is that these are real events. But after that, then you can start to do what we've been talking about, which is to break the social norm and then bring it down to the next level and check in and be able to name conflicted feelings. This would be something that therapy is unique in therapy for the client. So if you don't bring attention to them, likelihood is that they won't. They won't feel like they can. They won't feel like it's safe. Their maladaptive coping skills around not sharing difficult emotions will only be reinforced. So having said that, to one degree to another, all clients are going to have some degree of resistance. And research shows that this is a reason that they leave treatment early, is when these particular conflicted feelings are not integrated into treatment. So some other ways to look at resistance: therapist will blame client or puts therapist in hierarchical position. Fears about this, that you're going to act out what they are familiar with. Why wouldn't they, right? This is what we're constantly listening for. Now, we may not want to bring up some of this resistance because we want our therapist to like us, and or that we're not taking cultural specific issues into account, and that the therapist wants to avoid these kinds of confrontations or uncomfortable feelings for their own reasons. So one reason is that, it's challenging, again, to move into the therapeutic relationship versus the social norm relationship. And again, that is not to be underestimated. We engage with people as we have learned to engage with people, and we come to people with warmth and wanting to understand, and all the wonderful ways that we've had conversations with our friends and family members would be normal for us to then, for that to show up when we're beginning to do therapy. But just a reminder that we want to step out of that role and into bringing awareness down to deeper levels for the client. If not, client will be far less likely to benefit from treatment, and that process comments do play out in issues of resistance. And it's very important to ask questions in continuing in an affirming way and with genuine concern. Okay, so as you see the behaviors start to be consistent, then okay, this is something that I need to explore with my client. So you want to anticipate that the client will experience self-blame around not being able to do it right or to have these conflicting feelings in the first place. And as you start to identify what these coping strategies are, what's behind the manifest behavior of the avoidance, for example, you can start to identify through resistance the maladaptive behaviors of the outdating coping strategies that we're helping the client identify. And ultimately, we want to help the client realize that they don't need this particular coping strategy. And I put an asterisk here. This process varies with each client. And what you want is, again, to collaboratively explore this with the client rather than give the client an impression that they need to disarm their coping strategies rather than engage in the process around their experience of bringing attention to these coping strategies. Okay, so formative experiences will definitely show up in resistance. And this is going to give you an opportunity to identify common themes, issues around what affect states are most challenging for clients. And again, as a focus of treatment. And you want to validate. And this takes a while. So this will continue to show up in therapy. But you want to clarify good reasons for resistance based on client's history in family and culture. And again, this is something that you explore. Again, you explore their experience with this rather than identifying it for themselves as if you know their experience. You want to get them to talk about their experience. So you can look at this process of working with the client's reluctance to deal with resistance. I think this is a helpful way to say it. So again, identifying the outdating coping strategy. I would use the example of avoidance. Validate the protection this one's provided. So how you really worked hard to protect yourself using a way of staying quiet or avoiding confrontation. That really worked for you. Ensure this is not repeated in a process way in treatment. So you don't want to not bring attention to, again, the how they are avoiding bringing up issues of reluctance. And sometimes that can be as simple as noticing eye contact or avoiding eye contact or tone of voice. And ultimately, the experience that as they experience this different with you, a more direct and open expression of their conflicted feelings, that of course they're going to experience this with others. So it's usually negative experiences with the therapist, not because of the therapist, but with the therapist, that lead to early termination. And simply that they didn't feel safe bringing up what felt uncomfortable. So we want to help identify early on to prevent this. And with a warm and supportive approach. And acknowledge and appreciate the client's willingness to talk about their resistance, because it was unsafe to do this. And we want to reinforce that shift. That is an emotional shift that's happening. And we want to be able to reinforce it. We don't want to just to miss that opportunity. So how do you know when resistance is occurring? And there's some really good bullet points on page 81. That's definitely worth taking a look at. So some of the obvious ones are if client misses multiple appointments, the client has very limited hours when to be available for therapy, the client asks to reschedule frequently, the client doesn't want to make a firm commitment, the client attends sessions but remains vague and is reluctant to talk freely, avoids topics, and then all of a sudden doesn't want to talk about an issue that's been brought up and felt to be important. But it's important to know how these can be different for each person. So this is not, obviously this is not a one size fits all. But through these ways that the client shows their resistance, there is an opportunity to build a hypothesis about what the resistance is about. So just to repeat, there's different possible reasons with each client. The working hypothesis about how therapy may be adverse to clients. These are working hypotheses. So the resistance can also be a way to manage these very, very powerful and difficult emotions, particularly shame. And, you know, it is in these moments when they're feeling like they are at an impasse about how safe it feels to bring something up, that they will then bring in their schemas, their maladaptive coping strategies, to try and cope with those moments. The client resistance needs to be explored through process comments. And so you, again, just like you're doing any other process comment, you want to bring attention to how the client is showing you their resistance, and to do that in a very warm and empathic way. And going back to one of the basic ideas in the beginning, resistance is an expression of what was shaped by early experiences of closeness and bonding. So you're really, in a way, you're talking to the client, who might be very raw in their emotions around these experiences of quite profound disappointment around not being able to voice their needs and concerns. So eventually you do want to tie their maladaptive behaviors to how you're thinking about the client's behaviors from a point of view of their formative years. And again, you don't have to be right, but you do have to be respectful, and you do have to say it in a way that expresses wondering and engages collaboration. Rather than, I realized that you come in, you miss appointments because it wasn't safe for you to talk, particularly around what you told me about last week. You want to always engage that collaboration. And this also allows you to engage more rather than avoid resistance. You know, ultimately what we're wanting to do is for the client to start reflect what's safe, what isn't safe. Is this a place where I need to continue my coping strategy in this relationship with this person in this moment? And just processing the emotional behind the resistance in a way that the client does not feel judged or blamed in and of itself is a corrective experience. So for example, a client who avoids engaging with others by actively placing attention on this avoidance, like for example, incidents of misappointments, and then how that coping strategy of avoidance served them, and to open up an exploration of why then it's challenging to bring up conflicting feelings between the client and the therapist. This might come up as early as your initial phone call. So you want to remember when you take that phone call, you know, to make sure that you give yourself some space. This is not just a normal phone call that you're making it, even though it can feel like it's a business part of your work. Oh, I'm scheduling an appointment. Really remember that this isn't a moment to engage with your client, and some of these themes might come up right off the bat. And this can be very vulnerable for clients, and it often is. And then this is where you model from the get-go your approach as being collaborative and engaging the client's point of view. So you always, at the end of the session, and especially in the beginning, just ask how it was for the client to be in your session today. Matter of fact, you can even talk about this in your practice sessions. How was this session for you today? Set the tone that the clients can bring up what feels like it's not working or confusion. Did something not feel right? What felt right? What didn't? Was there anything that felt awkward today? Something that might be that we could talk about? And again, this is something in and of itself that would be a corrective emotional experience for the client, for most clients. So if a client comes in and is particularly assertive and critical, you're going to have to, it's going to feel like an interpersonal conflict resolution. And research shows a tendency to counter your client's critical views of treatment or the therapist. So this is going to be, even with our best intentions, this is going to be a likely response. So you want to, important to receive support, especially if this is strong for your client. Because ultimately you want to address the client's accusations from a place of openness, warmth, and understanding. And and the fact is, it's generally not about the therapist, even if the client is making it about the therapist. So they really want to make sure the client knows their concerns are heard, regardless of whether you agree with what they see as problematic. And we've talked about cultural differences. Well, obviously we talk about that a lot in the society and the individual class. So that obviously applies when you are trying to make some hypotheses about client resistance. So they give you a way of thinking about resistance in terms of what occurs. So rupture would be misunderstanding. Reenactment would be that they are repeating what they did with the other people in their lives. And then resistance involves multiple or contradictory feelings, which are too overwhelming for the client to put into words. So when you help them process their contradictory feelings, you are going to actually provide permission to talk about concerns, explore what feels dangerous to the client, and then to tentatively interpret reasons. And again, this is tentatively, you can explore with the client and begin to identify some focus of treatment. So shame is really important when working with in resistance, and it's different than guilt. Shame is about who I am, and guilt is about what I did. I am wrong versus I did something wrong. Noticing shame through perfectionism, blaming or criticizing, temper outbursts, being edgy or explosive, low self-esteem, and even chronic depression. So shame is a global experience of who I am. And behind shame is that you expose these feelings of contempt because you have been made to feel like you're worthless. And this also can lead to isolation. So particularly around shame and rage, this is an attempt to disprove shame unworthiness. probably comes out in a way that is hard to know that that's what is fueling the rage. And it certainly is related to types of abuse. Help client recognize feelings which originally existed when they were shamed in childhood. Now, this is super important, and this takes a long time. And this is not something that's going to happen necessarily in the very beginnings of therapy, when resistance might initially show up, and it's important to recognize it early on. But this is just more of a way to know what you're up against when you're helping someone deal with childhood shame. It's that there are usually really overwhelming feelings that never got to be expressed, that were never supported and understood by the client. So again, shame anxiety would be a fear of revealing a sense of unworthiness to themselves, as well as to you. Fear of having an unworthiness revealed or overexposed. Want to develop self-compassion for ways they were shamed in childhood. So this is really important, and again, does not only occur during early signs of resistance. Now, you're going to have to tolerate your own feelings of shame. And so the good news is that with shame, as you identify it and talk about it and name it and respond to it and with compassion and empathy, that is the missing ingredient that increased and created and provided the conditions for the shame in the first place. But it has to be named for what it is. Okay, so in summary, listen to the client with presence and respect. It's always really a good reminder that we all have that built in already. Try and look for the feelings in the moment. So again, when you're doing the practice sessions, with all that's being said right now, what's the feeling underneath that? What's the feeling tone the client is sharing? And if I can't pick it up, this might be a moment to use that as a process comment. And you're saying a lot of important things, but you know what? I'm just not getting it on a feeling level. I'm wondering if it's because I've noticed that there has been a lot of different topics we've been talking about. Resistance will appear throughout therapy, and resistance provides a way to observe conflicts which impact your client. So it is a window. And the truth is these windows do close. So, I think it's fair to say that resistance is really a rich opportunity to understand, what it is that your client's bringing to therapy. Okay, I hope this was helpful. I look forward to seeing you all in our class on Wednesday night.